I do have a loud voice, so if I get really loud, please let me know. All right, is that looking right? Yeah. So I do, hopefully you gathered from my, sorry? Oh, that'll work. I'll walk around. Okay. Nope.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? So before I begin, I just want to say very big thank you to Mr. Bansal, to Dr. Sita Singh, to Dr. Gauri, and all the faculty staff and all of you here for welcoming us. It's been a great experience already, and hopefully a mutually beneficial one as well. I started on my presentation quickly, but and hopefully have time to interact with you later. But if you got from my profile, there's our guest very nicely presented. I have two areas of research, sport outcomes and also looking at IT workforce issues, and particularly some of the work that I've done related to women and girls in technology. So that is the second piece of what I will be presenting to you today, and hopefully you'll get interesting things out of it, and let me know if you have any questions. Quickly to position you where we started, can any of you guess how many women there are in the IT workforce in the United States? Percentage. What percent of IT professionals in the US are women? 40, 60, 70. Anybody? 60, 40, 30. We have some numbers. Phil, do you want to take a guess? 5? Right? 5%? Anybody else? 10%? Okay, now we're getting a little closer. Yeah, we have a range of numbers, but if you include IT and IT-enabled services, which, as you know, are not directly IT-related but supported by technology, we're looking at about a number close to 19%. But if you look at core IT, the number is even smaller. What is the percentage of women in your workforce here in India? In the IT workforce only? 40%? Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah, close to the numbers I have read at least are in the range of about 35 to 40%. And from when I interact with practitioners here in India, a lot of what we're hearing is they are concerned about fewer women being represented in the Indian IT workforce. So now hopefully you understand why we are so worried when we're looking at numbers in the range of anywhere from 5 to 19%. And the number has been going down since the 1980s. So that's really some of the work that Dr. Kaiser, and I'll call her Kate from here on, and I have been looking at is why are women not choosing IT careers in the United States, and what has been the impact of that. So one of the early models that Kate and I did was, has actually gotten a lot of attention among academics and even practitioners, is the early determinants model. And the key conclusions or key elements that we raised in this model was, as Kate said, a lot of women, girls particularly, decide in middle school and high school, which is anywhere from 6th to 12th class, that they will choose or will not choose IT. And usually by the time they reach 6th, 7th or 8th class, they have decided that IT is not their career. So we lose a lot of interest in IT right from the kindergarten through 12th scale. So by the time they come to college, a lot of them have decided they don't want to choose IT as a career. So we started looking at what influences people in taking or choosing IT as a career. And broadly speaking, if you look at this, you look at social factors, your family, your representatives in your household, your peer groups, media, they oftentimes will incentivize or disincentivize people from choosing careers. And a very interesting finding that we have had is that women whose father is in IT, they will tend to choose IT, but they're most influenced by mothers who are in IT careers. So if you have a sibling or a parent who is in the IT career, there's a better chance that you will end up choosing IT careers yourself. Also in your peer group, if there are individuals who have chosen IT, they will inspire you or motivate you to take IT as well. So those are two key influences on the social side. And then on the structural factors, oftentimes effects of teacher, counselor, access to technology, same-sex education was a factor, being in a girls' school versus a boys' school, because girls will often get intimidated as they see boys interacting with technology. They feel less competent. So we found there were some effects there that would be inspiring women to choose or not to choose IT as a career. And there were individual differences as well. So your personality, how you approach challenges, how you deal with difficulties also inspired people to choose or stay away from IT. So as we looked at this model, one of the things that we found that Kate and I kept talking about was there are clearly cultural influences. And I think this was particularly close to me because I lived in India till I was 23, and then I moved to the United States, and I knew there were differences in how we viewed technology careers in India versus how we viewed technology careers in the US. So that's really the piece of research that I'll describe a little bit here, is I started saying, well, if culture is affecting how women choose careers, it can also be, there can be cultural effects in how they experience IT careers once they get into the workplace. And so what I did was I interviewed, I applied the early determinants model to women who were already in the IT workforce in the United States. And so just to give you a background, I interviewed 31 women. There were 16 South Asian women, and when I say South Asian, they were primarily from India. There was one woman from Bangladesh. And I also interviewed 15 women who were born and raised and educated in the United States. So I'll refer to them as Indian and US-based women from here on. But just to give you a background, all the South Asian women, the Indian women and the Bangladeshi women, were born and raised in India, received at least their undergraduate degree in the United States, and that was a condition for participating in the study. And the same and the opposite, in a way, applied to the American women. That is, they had to be born and raised in the United States and have received at least their undergraduate education in the U.S. So what I did was I conducted about interviews with each of the 31 women, anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour 15 minutes, on why they choose IT careers, what their experiences were in the workplace, and try to draw comparisons between what were some similarities and differences between the two cultural groups. So I'll give you a quick overview, and then I do have more detailed slides on each one of these, which I may skip if you're able to spend enough time on this. So I'll highlight some key differences here, and if I'm in your way, just let me know. But the first and the most important difference that I found, and the women in both groups were solicited in identical ways. The same organizations, groups, and institutions were approached, and my call for request for participation was sent out to everybody who was in IT. So they self-selected into the research, and so, but the way they were solicited was identical. There were no differences. The first major difference to highlight, because it really affects a lot of the other findings, is that a majority of the women, the South Asian women is how I refer to them, South Asian women had technical degrees, and that were often graduate level, postgraduate level degrees. So they either had MS in some sort of technology related field, or had MBA in that related field. A lot of the American women that participated in this study often had undergraduate degrees, and many of them were on the non-technical side. Now, I will point out a key factor here is these were women who were in the IT workforce back in the middle, around 2005, 2006, which is when I started the study. So they were in their late 20s to early 40s was the range. And But this, in a way, highlights one of the first cultural differences, which is in India, we tend to, if you're going for a certain career, you go through your undergraduate and master's very quickly. You follow them one after the other. You don't take a break. Whereas in the U.S., it is very common to complete your bachelor's, start the work, and then decide if you wanted to come back to graduate school or not. So, in a way, this reflects one of those elements as well. But you see, this also has a trickle-down effect on other factors. So the first question I asked was, or one of the early questions I asked in the interview was, how do you perceive IT as a career? Do you perceive it as a masculine career or a feminine career or a neutral career? Most often the South Asian women said, they were actually surprised that I asked the question, because they said, well, IT is a very female supporting career or a neutral career, but almost every woman from the United States, the American women, they consider IT as a masculine career. Now think about it, I just had you think about numbers. If you're looking at 5 to 15% represented as women in the IT workforce in the U.S., most of your colleagues are men. And so it's shaping your perceptions as a masculine career. There are more men in the field. It's a career that's often taken up by men, and that's led to the perception there. So that's partly why you're seeing fewer and fewer women. Also, is because they're coming into high school and seeing IT as a largely masculine career and wanting to choose careers that are more friendly, let's say, to women, if I can use that term. Then I started asking them questions about how do you perceive the work environment in this regard. And do they see, and by the way, these are open-ended interviews, and I have to draw themes out. It's a pretty long, a 1-hour interview typically takes about 8 to 10 hours to analyze, so I can draw themes out. So one of the themes that emerged was how the perception of discrimination at many levels. Is there salary differences? Are there work differences? And generally, what we heard was from the South Asian women was a lower perception of discrimination in the work environment. That is, they felt the salaries were competitive, and how the work was allocated to them. Did they get technically challenging work as much as the men did? They felt they were almost equal with the men in their careers. But the American women felt that there was greater discrimination in the sort of work that was allocated to them. And in fact, one of the interviewees, who was an American, pointed out to me that some of the work that is given to her is generally what she felt was more customer support on the non-technical side. But when it came to giving the technical support, the more technical work, more hard skills, they typically just naturally wanted to go to the men. And in fact, she received a phone call from a user who said, I have a question that relates to hardware, and can you give the phone to Jim, who was her colleague? So they didn't want to talk to her, knowing that it was a hardware issue. She was not very happy about that. So it was the perception of the fact that some of the hard skills went to the men versus the women. They also, and I would say this, the South Asian women, when they talked about discrimination or discomfort in the workplace, it was mostly related to working with men on the social level. So from a work side, they were okay, but from the social side, they felt more discomfort. How did they cope with some of these things, the work environment? Most South Asian women had a very passive coping there. How do you deal with challenges in the work environment, or the discrimination, or the challenges of IT work? As you know, it's very demanding. And so a lot of them basically they were more passive. They said, this is how I have to do this, I have to work. And so they tend to let things go without challenging them. Whereas there was more of a rebellion against the discrimination from the American women in the work environment. So they challenged their bosses to give them more difficult. They asked why Jim was being given that particular task and not her. So, and again, as you might recognize, this is a cultural difference. We tend to be a little bit more passive when we perceive certain differences, whereas the women in the American workforce, they tended to be they tended to question a lot more, and that I felt was one of the interesting differences. One of the themes that also emerged was how do you get mentored into the work environment? And a lot of the South Asian women said, oh, we don't have a mentor. Or if they had mentors, they were most often senior males in their organization. And again, this is reflective of the American work environment where there are very few women in leadership roles in IT. And as you can see, I've got a lot of girls here from Marquette University. They're our future. So we're hoping to change that, but the number of women in senior leadership is very few in the IT workforce. That's a challenge. Among the American women, they had some senior women as their mentors if they were available. Otherwise, most of them had peers as their mentors. And so, as you can see, if you have a senior mentor, there's a chance you can get pulled up in the organization. So again, that was an interesting difference here. Both groups felt the work-life balance as a challenge equally. The IT work is difficult, it's demanding, if there's a call, you have to be available, and so they felt that usually work balance issues, if people perceive that their work and life balances are different or difficult, they will choose to either leave or make some changes in the work environment. So turnover intentions, which is my second last line, is do they decide to leave or not? If you find IT work to be difficult, is it if you decide to leave, or how do you address that? And most South Asian women said, our IT work is difficult, I don't get enough time with my family, but I'm not going to leave my job. Maybe I'll go part-time, or we'll just figure some way out. My husband will support me, or whatever that may be. But American women actually demonstrated a greater tendency to want to leave IT work altogether because they felt that it was difficult to cope with the IT work and families as well. This was interesting because when I probed a little further, if you will notice in my second last line, it says high career entrenchment. And that's because of my first line there. Once you get to a master's level degree and you spend 4 or 5 years working, the South Asian women felt that they could not leave their career. This was their life. They were with it, and they had spent so much time getting college education and so much time in the workforce, they were there forever. And so the higher career entrenchment can be good in a way, but it also, for some of them, was leading to a level of frustration where they felt they couldn't leave the workforce because they had gotten these high-level degrees. And then there's a concept in IT that we've been looking at, which is managerial or technical competence, which is basically saying, in the long term, where do you want to be? Do you want to be in a technical role or in a managerial role? And most South Asian women demonstrated technical competence. That is, they wanted to remain in technical careers, they wanted to stay on in those lines, they were not interested in moving into managerial roles. And one of them actually said very seriously to me, and I almost laughed at it, I had to control myself, was, it's easier for me to manage hardware and software than it is to manage people. So that was a feeling that came out quite a bit. And most American women wanted to move out of the more technical roles, whether it was support or hardware or software, and move into more leadership roles when that occurred. So just some key differences that emerged. Again, themes were driven by the I asked questions about why you choose IT, how is your work experience, and as they talked, I was able to draw out more questions about their experiences. So, So a lot of these, I've already talked about some of these factors. I won't go into each of these details, but there was some that I wanted to point out. Was a lot of the American women wanted to leave the workforce also, not just because of the work-life balance, but also because they felt they were not valued enough in the organization, and also because there was a threat, a perceived threat of the offshoring of IT work. Whereas the women who, from the South Asian side, who wanted to leave the workforce, there were very few who did indicate they wanted to leave, they found the IT work very demanding, but also there were some that wanted to return back to the country. And how they dealt with it was mostly through spousal support or deciding to move part-time. But many of the South Asian women were afraid to go part-time because they were afraid of losing their jobs. So that was another factor. So just some, without taking more time, just some of the things that I wanted to focus on was what are some areas to consider, and I have these are more research-oriented presentations. But as one of the things I'm hearing from practitioners here in India as well is that there are fewer women choosing IT careers now. It used to be when I was here at college, you were an engineer, or you did BCom, or you were a doctor, but there are more career opportunities now available to you. So just by show of hands, how many of you, just men and women, or you're not boys and girls, I can't even call you men and women, you're so young. How many of you are specializing in IT? Anybody from NDIM? How many of you are either thinking about IT? Yeah? Sorry, not thinking about it at all? No, we're not thinking about it. What are you thinking about? Just throw out some majors. How many marketing? Okay. How many finance? All right, those were my two biggest guesses. That's how we are in the U.S., finance and marketing. Just where do you think your technical skills are coming from? What sort of schools? So if I'm a client organization, we've got some provider organizations here. Where are you hiring practitioners? Where are you hiring your technical folks from? What sort of schools?
Management schools.
Management schools. Where do you see yourself going with marketing, finance? Are you looking into those specific roles? Where do you see yourself, some of you going? What sort of organizations? One hand, two hands, anybody? What sort of company would you like to work for with marketing or finance sort of background?
Advertising.
Advertising? Okay. Anybody else? Okay, so more on the finance side, but okay, all right. So again, as you can see, and you do have IT or MIS as a specialization here, from what I understand?
IT is a mandatory subject in the first year.
Oh, I see.
They all need to know.
They all need IT, but there's no specialization as such.
We have specialization, but small numbers.
Okay, few numbers. Okay. So again, something to look out for. As Kate highlighted in her research, we are facing in the United States a shortage of IT folks. Your people here are concerned that we might be losing some of the women in the IT or from the IT side. And again, when you think of your workforce, at least in the U.S., we're about 50-50 men and women. If you're only attracting 19%, or you only have 19% representation in your females in your workforce, it's a growing challenge. So something to look out for you as well. There are very exciting careers for many of you in marketing, finance, and so on, and market is just opening up. But also as you move into leadership roles, think about trying to keep increasing the numbers or keep the numbers steady in the work environment and the IT side as well. So I'll stop here. I know we've taken more time than planned. Any questions? This was very more specific research study, but any questions or comments would be welcome as well. Questions? All right. Well, thank you, and I hope to interact with you outside of the presentation.